This is a Momentum Media production. Space Connect podcast. Stories, opinion, and insights on the key factors shaping the development of Australia's space industry and how you can connect your business with this emerging sector.
Hello everybody, my name is Adam Thorn and welcome to the Space Connect podcast. Now this week we have a returning guest, Paul Hawkins, who is the founder and chief combobulator, and we'll get to that later, of an organisation called Crazy Might Work. So Crazy Might Work describes itself as a for-purpose leadership and innovation academy launched in Antarctica that aims to train and develop caring and courageous leaders. But basically they go into other organisations and they kind of teach them how to create a culture like they have in NASA. More recently, they won an OzSpace 2025 award for Workforce Initiative of the Year. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Adam. Great to be here.
So we've had you on the show before, which was a year ago. So for those of people that aren't aware of yourself and Crazy Might Work, could you give us a kind of a gist of what it is you guys do and maybe talk about a kind of origin story almost in terms of how this all came about?
Thanks, Adam. Well, yeah, weirdly, we actually launched Crazy Might Work in Antarctica, which turned out to be a bit prophetic because, as you know, we're now running the four-dimensional leadership program, which is made famous by NASA. They just won Best Place to Work 13 years in a row as it May this year. And that program has really been transformational for them, but for many other organizations as well. So there are about 100,000 leaders now around the world that have done that program. And we've really just been popularizing it in Australia. But the connection back to Antarctica is that Antarctica is actually one of the primary places where astronauts get trained for missions and are being prepared for long space travel. So it's just kind of ironic that we've ended up doing, running that program when we actually started out in a place where that's very prominent and front and center from a space program perspective. But I guess, and maybe just to round it out for your subscribers, the other thing that we do is we run a strategic innovation program. So we run that with a couple of professional bodies in a white labeled format. And that's just about what you need to know as a leader when you're trying to deliver really innovative thinking and strategy. If the NASA program is very grounded in social neuroscience, so all the latest research in that area, our strategic innovation program is more about, I would say, cognitive neuroscience. That's about how do we max out the human brain, whether we're using artificial intelligence or not, but ideally, augmenting that human intelligence in a way that really makes sense, that gets the best of both happening together. So that's the, in a nutshell, what Crazy Might Work do. We really, out there giving permission, to leaders to try something a bit different, stretch their brains, use their brains a bit differently. And of course, the NASA program is just a wonderful professional development experience, that based on the space program. So what's not to love? It's stretching and exciting. So between those two things, that's the sort of gamut of work that we do.
It's really interesting you said that because in a lot of organisations, when they bring somebody in to do like staff training, everyone rolls their eyes. Why are we having to do that? If you bring someone in, they're like, we're going to teach you how NASA do it. Suddenly everyone's engaged. I'd imagine when you're doing these things, you've got your room full of people that are all paying full attention to this.
Absolutely. There's certainly with the current space program, there's a huge amount of interest globally, and I think that's growing in Australia. So I think people know that it's a frontier, which makes it interesting. There's so much tech in our everyday lives, including GPS that we wouldn't have were it not for the space program. So I think everyone peripherally knows that we're getting all of these, beautiful benefits in medicine and science and technology flying through from that program. And so it's kind of intriguing to get a bit of a peek in, to be an astronaut for a day or two as part of this program and just have some kind of direct experience of that. So I think, most people would find that intriguing, even if they're not planning to go to Mars anytime soon.
It's quite interesting because when people think of NASA now, they think of an organization which is very, very, very well run because it's the oldest cliche in the industry. Space is hard, but NASA's kind of hit rate of doing things over the last kind of 20 years has been extraordinary. Kind of what did NASA do really to kind of, I say turn it round, but to go from a place where, you know, it was haphazard if things would go wrong to being so on the ball? Because I think a lot of our listeners will know when we had the issues with the Boeing astronauts that went up last year to the ISS, and NASA were very much like safety first, safety first, safety first. They prioritized at every point and they handled a difficult situation quite well. How did NASA sort of change their culture to make it so strong now?
Well, I think with any organization that's been around as long as NASA has, you have ebbs and flows, right? There are times when things are not going well and there are times when things are going great. And a lot of people are not aware that NASA actually went through a pretty distressing period between sort of a book ended by the Challenger disaster and the Columbia disaster. That couple of decades in there was not a great period for NASA. So there were a lot of Mars mission failures. There was the Hubble telescope which went to space and didn't work. A whole lot of expensive and in some cases fatal errors during that period. So. And I think NASA lost their way a little bit there. On the back of a very successful Apollo program, there was this period where there was certainly a dip in performance and culture. And it was only really when Charlie Pellerin, the head of astrophysics, put up his hand and said that Hubble telescope mission is a leadership failure and I take responsibility for that things started to change. And Charlie was really instrumental in putting together this 4-dimensional program for leaders and teams, which I think has really changed outcomes for NASA, and it's brought them back to the glory days of the Apollo program. And I think a huge part of that, Adam, as you rightly point out, is safety. Right? It's that people first, kind of safety first culture, and so I don't think they're rolling the dice with human lives on the program. And I think we saw that very clearly in that whole episode with with the ISS that you mentioned. So, yeah, some positive changes.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I sort of moonlight. I also do a bit of aviation as well. I do the whole kind of aerospace gamut. And in aviation, for those people that aren't aware, they talk about the kind of almost Swiss cheese model of safety, which is that you have backup after backup after backup after backup, which is how aviation is so safe. But I imagine in space, it's times by 100 because the risks are so much harder. And I would imagine that it's not just about the procedures in place, but it's about the culture you create as well. And it's about that culture and whether a junior person will speak up. And that's what they're trying to create, a culture where everyone feels they can speak up and be part of things.
Yeah, well, if you want something that's really fatal, in the context of safety, just try a culture that is toxic and that prevents people speaking up. So I think that's probably the core realization when the investigations happen and the Senate inquiries. What eventually dropped out of that was that it was a cultural and a leadership problem, right? And the main part of that was that people weren't comfortable speaking up. So, it's not enough just to have a psychologically safe environment, because you need accountability and you need high performance and all of those kinds of things. But it's still the foundation, because if you don't have that, you can't get to the other interesting bits. So I think it's really fundamental. We see that in aviation as well. If you look at Korean Airlines, when they were 17 times the failure rate and, fatality record of every other airline, that turned out to be, the co-pilot not being confident to speak up and contradict a more senior pilot. And so something as simple as that, a little cultural quirk, can be really, really dangerous. And NASA realized that. And so the first thing this program does is address that, right? It creates a safe space. Just because you're a double PhD doesn't mean that you'll always speak up. So the leadership need to send a very clear message that it's perfectly okay to disagree and to hold up, $1 million missions if there's any concern around safety. So I think that's an absolute baseline for high performance.
Well, talking about, and this may be a terrible link, talking about good culture, you won an award for Workforce Initiative of the Year. So you're practicing what you preach. Workforce Initiative of the Year at Beyond Space 2025. Awards, which, as we record this, took place a few weeks ago. Could you tell us a little bit about kind of what your entry is, what you did, and maybe why you think you won?
Yeah, we had a wonderful start, with the program that we offer today, Adam, because Charlie Pellerin, who architected it back around 2000, pretty much gave us carte blanche. And he said, you do whatever you want with this, with this RP, and you modernize it, you change the exercises. So we just really had carte blanche to look at current space programs, speak to astronaut trainers and astronauts, and really just bring it up to date with all of the great research that's coming out of astronaut training and analogs like Antarctica and Mojave and all of these places where astronauts are being prepared for long space travel. There's some very unique studies that are happening there because, when you put someone in a Mars-like habitat and throw away the key for a period of time, in Antarctica it's over winter, you get to see some unusual things because human beings are in isolated, confined, extreme conditions. So there's a lot of variables that are removed from that picture that would normally just impinge as part of everyday life. So you really get to learn what is great leadership, what makes a team cohesive. And so I think what we've been able to do with this program is really just bring it in line with the space program, give a pretty authentic experience, but at the same time extract all these, wonderful epiphanies that have come out of that contemporary research. At the same time, we've incorporated things like simulations, which NASA is very heavy on. So actually giving you an experience of what it's going to be like to do something under pressure with emotion. And we know that's, if you look at Sully's landing in just outside New York on the Hudson, emotion is everything, right? Everyone's a good pilot when everything's going fine, but it's when the chips are down and you've got a lot of pressure and very limited reaction time. So you really want to recreate those kinds of situations and build confidence that there's recall and there's responsiveness when the chips are down. So that's really what we've tried to do with the program, Adam, is first of all, modernize it, bring it up to speed with research, but then create an experience that's simulated, that's realistic, and that actually allows those skills to develop in a realistic environment.
It's interesting you talked there about the importance of simulation. So it was slightly different, but at the Ozspace Awards, I had the best seat in the house because I was next to two astronauts on my table, which is about as good as it gets. One of them was Eric Phillips. So for those who aren't aware, he flew on a private SpaceX mission. So not NASA, but he literally just splashed down 6 weeks or so from when we hosted the awards. And I was on the table and I was saying to him, like, were you terrified when you're sat in that rocket and it's going up to space? Are you fearing for your life? And he said, no, because we've been through everything over and over and over and over and over and over again for 18 months. We've been through all the ramifications. We've been trained up. We knew we had the people. And so when I was sat there, I wasn't nervous. I was totally calm. And I suppose it does bring that home that the more you can prepare people for those difficult situations, the easier it will be. And I suppose it's the same in an office as well, because in an office, there's going to be arguments, there's going to be rows, things are going to go wrong. I suppose the more you can train people to think this has happened before, you're not the first person to do this, that the better they're going to react to things.
100%. And I think it's dealing with the emotions in a constructive way. So we were chatting earlier, and I was just talking about the exercise that we did at the conference where we simulated an astronaut selection process, which is really about getting people to fail. So it's, stepping exercise, counting backwards, and, we can only, our human working memory only goes so far. So at some point that's bound to fail. But the actual exercise is about the emotional processing of that, so the self-regulation that we can learn to do. We can't do it necessarily off the bat, but we can learn to go, I'm experiencing a bit of anxiety or whatever it is, but then how do you process that? And, can you relabel that as excitement, which is, as I'm sure, exactly what Eric's been able to do, being put in that situation a couple of times. You go, well, my heart's beating, it's off the scale, my blood pressure's up, all of my breathing's accelerated. But how do I process that? And that takes a bit of practice to think about it differently and then actually be, if not excited, at least high functioning with all of that stuff going on. And it's the same in the work environment. Think about when someone sits down and says, need to talk about your performance or, performance reviews, all those kinds of things, which hopefully you're out of, Adam, but I'm sure somewhere in your past you've had this experience. But, those are all things that heighten emotion. And so if you can get a chance to practice those as a leader in a realistic situation, then you are going to be better at it. It's practice.
So one of the main kind of programs that you teach when you go into organizations is this sort of 4-dimensional leadership program. And this is the one that was made famous by NASA. Can you talk to us a little bit about its origins, its purpose, and a little bit in detail about how that particular program works?
Yeah, sure, Adam. It really breaks leadership down into 4 dimensions. And the way that NASA do it is kind of interesting because they actually leaders do it together with their team. So they actually do it as an intact unit. And they actually go through the whole process together. So there's this idea of distributed leadership at NASA, which is about the thought that everyone is going to be required to lead at some point. And so, why wouldn't you have a level of leadership skills throughout the team? Because it's going to be a time when only the astrophysicist knows the answer. And so that person needs to step up and have a strong opinion and potentially take control of the direction of the group, or at least be very influential in the decision making. So what this program does is it really starts off at perhaps the simplest level, although possibly not, but looking at how do we build people? So how do we identify what your strengths are as idiosyncratically as possible, right? So we don't want any sort of descriptions of that, but to work out what you're really good at, and then how do we ensure that you get developed in relation to that? So that's the first, I guess, people building dimension. It's all about the individual, how we bring out the best in them, and then how do we connect up those individuals? So how do we create shared interests? If you're bringing together a group for the first time, what is the mission? What is the thing that we're all interested in? And what's the thing that you want for yourself that I can also want for you? So just, creating that very human connection at a starting point. And then it spirals out. So we then go into team building. We then go up to systems building, which is how do you build human systems where there's no role overlap, there's very clear accountabilities, all of those kinds of ways that you structure a team to be really high performing, where everyone has authority to make the decisions that actually determine whether they are successful or not. And then it moves right up to the highest level, which is around how do we set a compelling vision and mission together with our teams, and then how do we articulate that for others, so that it's really clear where we're going and why, and everyone's excited about it. So it really covers all of those elements. And I think if you're able to do those 4 things as a leader, you're going pretty well, because you're bringing out the best in the people that you have under your remit, and they're going to be flourishing and excelling if those 4 dimensions are in balance. So that's the summary version of the program. And then underneath all of that, there are a number of other specific behaviors that leaders require, like being able to have those difficult conversations that we were talking about earlier, being really skilled at that, and really using all 4 dimensions to communicate, as well as other applications. So, but the summary, moving through, thinking of it as sort of escalating up from individual to whole of organization conversations is not a bad way to conceptualize it.
So what is the kind of impact that this program will have on leaders and organizations? Like what is almost like when you get spat out at the other end of this, what are you hoping to achieve? How would someone maybe be a better leader, or your organization be better than before they went into it?
The feedback that we've had in Australia is that it's been transformational. So the organizations that have committed to it and sent more than one leader through the program have said that it's created this transformation in their, not only their leadership, but their culture, because obviously leaders influence that disproportionately. So we've seen, and if we look at government agencies, which have a pretty uniform way of measuring things, so they have a Employee Matters survey, which runs right across the public sector. What we've seen with those is that they have probably an average of about a 12% improvement across those measures. Anything that's leadership orientated. In terms of the program itself, we are recording the highest employee net promoter scores that they've ever had for any program that they've run in some cases. So 9.5 out of 10, which if you know anything about NPS is pretty good. So I think it's delivering a good experience, but it's actually also having a transformational impact. You asked me what's the effect at a personal level. I think it's confidence, right? Because coming out of this program, in the same way Eric was saying that he didn't feel nervous about flying the spaceship because he felt like he knew exactly what to do and he'd been there many, many times. I think that's what a simulated leadership experience does, is it just gives you fluency and confidence that you can actually, under pressure, recall the key behaviors and execute them. So I think there's nothing like that for building confidence. And so I think you're going to feel very capable as a leader by the end of this program.
So obviously we know this is something that NASA used, but are there other organizations that either use this program or perhaps something similar?
So the NASA program is pretty much a gold standard for leadership globally, right? So there are about 100,000 leaders now that have been through the NASA 40 program around the world. I don't know if there's any equivalent of that, and that's in every industry that you can possibly imagine. So, if you think of 75 countries and everything from mining to space, although that's probably closer than we imagine, then you've got this incredible uptake and transferability, because the program is not fundamentally about space, right? Although it's been applied there first, it's just about what is great leadership, what ticks the boxes from a human perspective in terms of what we know from neuroscience and psychology, and then how do you do that as a leader to bring out the best in your direct reports and your teams. So I think that's what makes it work in such a variety of different environments.
And how does it differ from a traditional, say, leadership program that companies will send people on? It sort of sounds to me on the surface that it's less about giving you a rigid list of rules and more about telling you, how to react under pressure, how to simulate things go wrong. But what is it almost like the core difference between this and a traditional leadership program that I'm sure all of our listeners have been through at one stage in their career or other?
Yeah, look, I think one salient difference is that it was developed originally by an astrophysicist, right? The head of astrophysics at NASA. So that's a bit of a different perspective to most leadership programs in terms of just the thinking about forces and physics and that kind of empirical investigation of what it is that makes for great leadership. So I think a lot of contemporary leadership programs are put together after 20 interviews of leaders, and we go, well, what is it that they have in common? And so therefore, once we've worked out what those three things are, if everyone does those, then they will surely also be great leaders. But what that does is it conflates a number of things that are not necessarily true. And I think the difference with the NASA program is that it actually views social context as a force. So it's an invisible force that explains human behavior in a social context. And then very closely related to that is the concept of social neuroscience, which is, we used to have a bunch of theories like Maslow's hierarchy and all of these things that we thought were conceptually great ideas, that they made sense. Yeah, we could explain human behavior with those things. But what we actually found out is when you put electrodes on someone's head and you actually watch what happens in the brain, it's not what you thought. So I think that's the difference between historical, psychometrics, psychological theory, and then, at worst, probably pseudo theory, which is sort of conflating behaviors that are observable. So I think the difference is the science. That's why it worked at NASA. And there's plenty of double PhDs in that. So you're not going to get away with with glib statements around why these things should be believed. And so having that scientific, that hard science underpinning it to go, I can actually show you this happening in your own head. So we can put electrodes on you and I can make you feel excluded from a group. And then we can see what that brain signature is on EEG. We can take bloods and we can show you that we've created a level of discomfort. And we can actually do that through leadership behaviors as well, through things like micromanagement or, other, tail clipping behaviors actually produce the same result. So there's good science, and I think that's part of what makes it different.
It's interesting you said that there, because I kind of think in a lot of organizations, and this is sort of life, the people that rise up aren't necessarily the best at their job, but they're the best that talk a good game. But if you work at NASA, that's not going to wash, because when you're dealing with the level of complexity they need people that are really good. And it was interesting you said there that, all of this stuff is proven, and that there's that background behind it.
Yeah. And the interesting learning for NASA was that they had plenty of double PhDs who are absolutely the experts in their area. You got Nobel laureates, you got all sorts of people working in that organization that are exceptionally good at what they do technically. But what they realized was that there was something more important in the context of a social group, which is leadership, which you haven't necessarily been, you've come through MIT or Harvard or Stanford University, even if you've worked at Caltech, that doesn't guarantee that you've actually had that training. So you may be very smart, but still not know how to bring out the best in people. And if that means that there's reluctance then to share information, then that can be fatal in an environment like that. So I think it's that realization that there's more to leadership than technical competence. And then once you know that, how do you really accelerate that development so that you have exceptional leaders coming out of a leadership development process?
So we've talked a bit there about the kind of the outcomes and what we're looking to develop in people. Let's just say somebody listens to this, they're an organisation, they're thinking of getting you guys in. The people that are on these programs, what are the kind of activities they're going to be doing? What are they going to be experiencing? Could you give us a flavour of some of the things you will do in those sessions?
So it's very simulation heavy. And the reason for that is because we want to create an experience that actually is not just cognitive, right? So we don't want leaders to go through this in a purely cerebral kind of way, going, oh, that's an interesting theory. I really love that concept. We actually want them to have a lived experience of it for some of the reasons we discussed earlier, that we actually want to create a level of comfort under pressure. And so we use a lot of simulations. Basically, in every module, there's something which is akin to space program training, but from a social perspective. So we're not going to do the recognize this rock or any of that technical piece. That's much more about how do we prepare you for human interactions that are going to be crucially important under pressure. So there's crash landing simulations, there's coronal mass ejection, so huge loads of radiation hitting a base. There are performance related discussions that happen around that. There's incidents on the moon, on Mars. So there's this kind of parallel journey where we're starting in Antarctica. We're moving through some experiences on the ISS and then off to the moon and then Mars, and then we bring that all back to Earth at the end, but selecting simulations from all of those environments that are going to be meaningful in some way from a social learning perspective and actually develop a leadership skill under those scenarios. So it's kind of a parallel journey that participants go on, Adam, where you're having the leadership development in conjunction with some pretty interesting stimulation from the program, space program itself.
So you've taken particularly the four-dimensional program and you've obviously adapted it a little bit to the organizations that you take it to. What are your aspirations for this for the future? Where can this go next? Because presumably it's kind of ever evolving all the time and, as I say, changing depending on who you're taking it with. But what's the future for this for you?
I think, we had a wonderful opportunity earlier in the year where Charlie actually gave us the opportunity to present the program as we run it in Australia to some of the US providers. So there are a handful of providers in the US that run the program. I would say pretty much in the same format as it was developed. So around the 2000s. And I think the way that we have reimagined it is quite starkly different, partly because I can't tell Charlie's stories, and I'll never be the astrophysicist that Charlie is. So I think there's a modification of the program to make that really accessible to a very wide range of industries, sort of demystifying it and making those leadership experiences really accessible. So I think we'd like to take that more places. We're actually planning a program at Cape Kennedy later in this year. So we'll actually take it back to NASA and actually run it on site there. And, I think deliver a very different experience to what I don't think there'll be too many people that will recall the 2000 version of the program. But if they do, this will be starkly different in terms of its content experiences and I think in a pleasing way. So we want to take it back to the US in partnership, obviously, with Charlie and some of our US colleagues and supporters. And then from there, I think the sky's the limit, Adam. I think, we'd like to take it international in the same way that Charlie did back in the sort of early 2000s. I think it just has very broad appeal, and I think we would be doing the program a disservice if we didn't get it out there. So I think, we really want to expand its presence in the year ahead.
And we talked about the four-dimensional leadership, but can you talk us through maybe some of the other programs that Crazy Might Work run as well?
Yeah, sure. So I'll say probably the primary other thing that we do is around innovation. And we do that also through a leadership lens. So we go, if you're a leader and you're wanting to do something highly innovative in your organization, you want to take your team to a place that, no one's gone before. So this is your own frontier, if you like. Then what do you need to know? So what are some of the some of the methods that are applied by the most serially creative people in the world. And so we've distilled that research and done some of our own around what really works. If you're wanting to tap human creativity and do it in a collective, a social environment like strategy, for example, how do you get that done? Or how do you bring out the very best of human cognition experience and develop something that's really, really innovative, but also likely to work? And of course, these days you can't even think about any of that without augmenting it with artificial intelligence. So the slight disadvantage we've got, though, just at the moment, Adam, is that we have a very basic understanding of human intelligence. And so that's a little bit scary when you start augmenting, because you might actually be replacing something that's highly functioning that AI can't do without realizing it. So I think it's saying, how do we play to our strengths as human beings and then augment that in an intelligent way? Because we actually know now that human brains are the equivalent of a supercomputer, right? So a human brain is capable of roughly an exaflop of computing, which is floating point operations per second, which is the equivalent of our current best performing supercomputer in the world. But the anomalous thing is that we've got a very limited working memory. So part of what we're looking at in that program is what is the kind of happy medium? What's the intersection between human and artificial intelligence? And then how do we get those two things singing along in harmony in a way that actually creates an exponentially better outcome? So that's really the underpinning, if you like. And then that gets applied to all kinds of innovation and strategy, from new market offerings right through to a complete repositioning of organizations. So that's the other thing that keeps us out of trouble.
I find this fascinating because obviously I work as a journalist. It's a very creative industry, and there's a magic about somebody that comes out with a brilliant idea, the spark that we don't entirely know. And some people, respond well to deadlines. Some people you just need to let them be. You think of a band when they come up with a great song. Maybe it just happens one day. Maybe it's a camaraderie. How are you able to kind of improve the circumstance for people to be innovative or creative? Because this feels like a really difficult thing to do. How do we get the best out of the creative mind?
So it's not a simple answer to it. But my own research has looked at over 300 biographies of serially creative individuals. So this is from your Mozarts and your Beethovens and your current musicians, artists, engineers, Nobel Prize winners, the whole remit of things that we would regard as creative, from performing arts right through to deep science, deep tech. So roughly 165 biographies of women and a lesser number of men. But just looking at what are some of those habitual things that they do, some of the rituals that they do to really be serially creative. So we're not looking at one-hit wonders, but looking at those that have won Nobel Prizes for continued breakthrough in a particular area. Same for musicians and sculptors and other kinds of creativity. And I love the way that you characterize that, by the way, because you really pulled out the idea that creativity takes many different shapes and forms, which is true. So looking at all of that and then going, sure, this stuff's kind of interesting, but what does the research say? And is there any intersection between all of this biographical information and hard research? So is there, some science that says why, for example, Dali falling asleep, holding a spoon over a metal plate would be able to drop the spoon and then wake himself up and paint what he had just seen in his mind's eye, that, incredible surreal art that he's so famous for? Why would that work? Like, what is going on in the human brain in that moment? And could we replicate that? Does that actually matter to anyone else? Is that reusable in any way, shape, or form? So I think those are the kinds of questions, that are yielding some really interesting answers. So we're actually discovering, for example, that what Dali was doing unbeknownst, and Edison did the same, a very similar kind of thing to generate his patents, is that they're actually dropping into an alpha brain state, which is like a meditative, daydreaming, freewheeling. The neuroscientists would call it hyperfrontality or cortical idling, as in the engine idle. But we're actually not really good at creativity when we're super activated, visually stimulated, all of these kinds of things. So this is why brainstorming doesn't work, for example, in the way that we expect, because we actually need to be in the shower or walking the dog or listening to music, whatever that thing is that actually gets us into a much more kind of relaxed state. So those are some of the learnings that have come out of that research, and those are things that we actively look to apply as part of that program.
It's really interesting you said that there, and I don't want to bring it back to me, but when I was starting off as a journalist like 20 years ago, and the name of the game is to get scoops or exclusives or do original things, and one of the things I learned very quickly is that you get this through ideas, and the way I always come up with it is I go for a run, and when I went for a run, I was completely chilled, and I wasn't worried about anything, and I could think things through in my head, and it's fascinating you said their brainstorms don't work, I suppose because you're almost putting pressure on the group. Can someone come up with an idea, which is the antithesis of how you come up with an idea. So I find that absolutely fascinating. The other thing I was going to say in terms of innovation and creativity is in my in a job I had maybe 6-7 years ago, I would present these like round tables, and one of our guests was somebody quite senior from from Microsoft, talking about AI and how this generative AI was coming down the road. She's like, it's going to change everything, and she was talking about how it worked as we've seen in the last few years. And she said, but one thing that we don't think AI will ever be able to do is true creativity. It can kind of fake it, but that spark of imagination is such a human thing. And you said earlier there, we don't realize our brain is a supercomputer. They talk about technology. We've already got that here. And I suppose actually, as we go into this new AI world, that human creativity and human innovation is going to be ever more important. So I suppose if you can drum that into the humans, then you're getting the best out of the humans, and you can let the computers do the dog work.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that you mentioned that you're most creative when you go for a run. Well, that's what sparks the.
Yeah.
So you're in great company there, and that walking or any form of exercise is a really common habit amongst these serially creative individuals. And we know now that even if you go for a walk or a run or even get on a stationary bicycle, you're actually much more creative than someone who's sitting in a meeting room, right? So it actually has a cerebral flushing effect on your brain. It's great for neuroplasticity. It's also very good for that kind of mind-wandering state that we spoke about earlier. And some of the latest science is telling us that the little brain, which is the cerebellum, which sits kind of under the main part of the brain, we always thought was just all about physical movement, enable us to balance and run around and do stuff in a coordinated way. But the latest neuroscience is actually telling us that could be the creative center of the human brain. So there's a lot of interesting developments in that area, but 100%, the exercise is a great way to get creative ideas. So that's Stanford research, which has demonstrated that pretty conclusively. So you're in good company there, Adam.
Right, time's almost beating us, but I want to wrap up with a couple more questions. If there's like one piece of advice or one kind of parting nugget that you could give to our listeners who are aspiring to be leaders or want to become better ones, what would it be?
Look, it's pretty hard to go. I had the privilege in my very early career of meeting Nelson Mandela. And I remember, the one thing that he was huge on was just this idea of education, not only in a formal sense, but the idea that you can always be learning, that there can be, lifelong exercise. And he modeled that by completing his law degree whilst on Robben Island in jail. So I think that's something that has really stuck with me, and I think that if there's one thing we need to be able to do in the contemporary world and with the advent of AI is learn to learn, right? And to be continuously, challenging ourselves, stimulating that gray matter and acquiring those new skills. So I think that's probably something that I'd like to leave with your audience, Adam, is just embracing that learning and going on a lifelong journey around just acquiring new knowledge and the pleasure and joy of learning something new or having an aha moment, to keep that part of your daily experience.
Now, very finally, we've been going on quite a while now. We've covered a lot of topics. If people want to find out more, if they want to get in touch with you, what's the next best step? How do they find out more about Crazy Might Work?
Well, they're welcome to reach out to me, paul@crazymightwork.com, Adam. And then also, obviously, through our website, crazymightwork.com is a great place to start. You can see, a range of different offerings there. And obviously, there's the opportunity to connect with me through that site as well. So either or.
Well, thank you very much for a fascinating chat and indulging in my ranting. It was very much appreciated. Thank you very much for joining us again, Paul.
You're welcome, Adam, and great to see you again.
And we will be back on this show the same time next week. But for now, for me and Paul, goodbye.